Does the president have a handle on what's going on?
White House aides will tell you that he does. Plenty of other people have a different opinion. And certainly, as you say, Katie, it's been whiplash today, yesterday, weeks now. Let's remember, it was Friday morning when news broke that Iran was willing to open up the Strait of Hormuz. Trump took to Truth Social over and over and over, declaring what a triumph this was and more or less saying that the war was over and the U.S. had won. But then he added that the U.S. would keep its naval blockade in place because he believed this was a good pressure tactic to get the final concessions they wanted from Tehran. Well, Iran answered that by saying, well, never mind then. We're going to close the strait. We're going to open fire on ships that went through there. And we have seen energy prices rise yet again. This is, and now with the news that the vice president and other outlets have matched what the New York Times is reporting, the vice president's trip has been postponed. It could be rescheduled. It still could happen. But right now, let's also remember the ceasefire deadline is tomorrow night, approaching rapidly. And Trump, in that interview with CNBC, in which he covered a lot of ground and was at times hard to follow, suggested that, yes, he expected he would be dropping bombs again. And now, that we have seen him bluff in the past. We have seen him threaten extraordinary amounts of violence, including just wiping out the entire Iranian civilization. So it's possible this is yet another negotiating tactic to get Iran to come to the table. But it's also possible that in 24, 48 hours or so, Katie, this war may be resuming.
So the conversation, I had at the top of the last hour, Max, the experts that I had on, including Aaron David Miller, suggested that what's going on here is that Iran holds the cards and Iran is purposefully sabotaging or withholding, knowing that Donald Trump desperately wants a deal. Do you read it that way?
I do. I mean, to me, what's really striking, just thinking over the whole trajectory of this war, which is now more than 6 weeks old, remember all of Trump's grandiose talk at the very beginning about regime change, about unconditional surrender, about getting to choose the next leader of Iran, and all of that. And instead, what we're in a situation now where Iran has a chokehold over one of the most important strategic waterways in the world, the Strait of Hormuz, through which about 20% of the world's oil flows. And Trump doesn't know what to do about that. This is kind of an economic superweapon that Iran has. And Trump is trying everything from blood-curdling threats against Iran to saying that he's going to destroy their civilization to trying to blockade their blockade. And none of it is really working. And I think what's clear is that the Iranians feel like they have the upper hand. Now, that may be, an exaggerated sense of confidence that they have because the U.S. obviously has the power to do great damage to Iran along with Israel. And they've already caused massive damage with the course of their bombing campaign, hitting more than 15,000 targets. But it hasn't really changed the fundamental strategic calculus of the war. And Trump continues to act as if the U.S. has won the war. And clearly, that's not how Iran feels. Iran feels like the U.S. is the one that needs to be making the concessions, and the Iranians are not going to do that. And so that's basically setting up an impasse, which is what we're seeing right now.
Does the White House have an idea of exactly what they might be willing to concede in a negotiation, Eli? Do they have all of their points laid out and know areas in which that they can compromise? Is there a plan?
Well, they've been clear, Katie, about what their red lines are in the more long-term negotiations. Less clear is maybe where the president is on continuing the blockade of Iranian ports in the Strait. We have a couple sources this afternoon telling us that that is one of the sticking points for Iran, and why Iran won't put its negotiating team on the plane to Islamabad is because they feel like they just cannot negotiate when the U.S. is still blockading the Strait, even after Iran said that they would open it up. I understand these discussions that are taking place through maybe a third party, through Pakistan, are very fluid and taking place right now, and that a lot of the discussion about whether or not J.D. Vance and others get on a plane, or whether the Iranian team gets on a plane, it comes down to whether or not they can agree on some terms now in terms of what is the ceasefire, how long it's going to look like, how long is it going to go, what will it entail, what's going to happen in the Strait. It sounds to me like a lot of those details, they're trying to work them out right now, and that is happening behind the scenes while as you point out, the president publicly is putting a lot of messages out there, and there is some very obvious incoherence in those messages when he is trying to do two different things at the same time, trying to keep the markets from getting the yips, as he might say, trying to calm the markets and reassure people that it's under control, and at the same time trying to scare Iran via threats on social media to make more concessions in the talks. I think in both cases, after weeks of these kinds of threats, they're kind of baked in at this point. You're not seeing the Iranians respond to that kind of pressure, and you're not really seeing the markets move much either. The markets seem to believe, because they've been pretty stable, that there will be a negotiated settlement at some point. If that all falls apart and we see a resumption of a U.S. military campaign, I would expect the markets will react more strongly.
Am I fogged up? Because I had Mike Lawler on, congressman here from New York, a little earlier, and he was saying that the war is going really well, that they're meeting all of their ends or goals, that the regime has been decapitated, decimated, that the military leadership has been decimated, that Iran is backed into a corner, and all that's happening right now is the negotiation on the finer points, and that to see it any differently is rooting for Donald Trump to fail and is a Democratic talking point. Is that how? Is there merit to that, Max?
No, I think Mike Lawler is just carrying water for the administration. That's pretty obvious. I mean, some things have gone well. I mean, there's no question that the U.S. and Israeli bombing campaign has caused a lot of damage to Iran, both military and economic. Again, as I mentioned, hitting something like 15,000 targets. But I would cite to you the words of Jim Mattis, Trump's first Secretary of Defense, where General Mattis recently said that targetry is not a substitution for strategy. And we've seen a lot of targeting by the U.S. military, but very little strategy on the part of President Trump and his advisors to try to translate the U.S. military accomplishments into something durable and lasting in terms of achieving U.S. objectives. And Trump has not even been clear on what those objectives are, as we know, because he's gone back and forth, regime change, no regime change. He said he doesn't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon, but, is he going to take out the uranium? All this kind of stuff has been, very much up in the air, and he gives often contradictory statements. And so it's not surprising that the U.S. is struggling to achieve an objective when the president can't even define what that objective is. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, despite all the damage that Iran has suffered, Iran still controls the Strait of Hormuz. They're very aware of that. They have a chokehold over 20% of the world's oil. And, Mike Lawler or anybody else can come on here and talk all day about how great the war is going. But the world knows different because everybody is terrified of what happens economically with the rate of inflation, with the gasoline prices and everything else, unless the Strait of Hormuz can reopen. And right now, I don't think President Trump has a good idea of how to reopen the Strait.
What are you hearing from the White House about the Strait and about Iran's leverage over it, John?
I mean, what they say privately and publicly are two different things. Yes, there's no doubt that, let's say, the Iran military has been damaged and the Iranian Navy has been damaged. But yet it doesn't take much of a Navy, Iran has proven, to control the Strait of Hormuz. It takes drones, some of them rather heavily armed. It takes these speed boats, these attack boats that can patrol the Strait. A man with a rocket launcher from shore, and certainly mines that have been put in the waters there. That's been enough. And we saw it on the weekend when the Strait briefly reopened. And then after Iran deemed it closed again, we did see a few ships test it. Well, they got fired upon and immediately turned around. So Iran does have control of the Strait. And that's where we are. And Eli was right a few moments ago when he was laying out what the U.S. hopes to accomplish here. But at the end, even if these goals are reached, it's not much of a victory. Let's recall, first of all, they're floating nuclear agreements that sound awfully lot like what the Obama team had nearly a decade ago. Yes, sure, the Ayatollah is dead. Well, he's been replaced with his son, who many believe is even more hardliner, and a newly emboldened IRGC, who don't seem like they're much interested in a deal. And any conflict that ends with Iran having more control of the Strait of Hormuz than it began, and that seems all but assured, whether they completely control it as they do now or some sort of system is put in place where they can exact tolls from ships that come through, therefore reviving the Iranian economy. If that's the case, if Tehran's going to have more control over the Strait than it did before this war began at the end of February, it's hard to view it as anything other than a defeat for the United States.
So on the new Ayatollah, this is another point I was going back and forth with Mike Lawler on. The reporting that I've seen from people who know him across various outlets is that he is more hardline. He's a creature of the IRGC, of the military. He's not particularly or as religious as his father was, and that he's potentially more dangerous. Lawler pushed back on that and said, what are these reports? How do you even know? I asked him, because he's on the Foreign Affairs Committee, if he had better information on who this guy was, and he never answered that. He went into a different direction. Max, what is the best understanding we have of who the new Ayatollah is?
Well, clearly, Mojtaba Khamenei is a very hardline figure who is closely associated with the IRGC, as are most of the other senior figures in this new Iranian government. I think the way it shakes out is still a little bit unclear, because you do have some more moderate, pragmatic figures like the foreign minister, but it's not clear how much power they actually exercise. And over the weekend, you saw the IRGC openly mocking the foreign minister, openly mocking the foreign ministry for saying that the Strait of Hormuz was open. And it's pretty clear that to the extent that regime change has occurred in Iran, as President Trump often says, the regime is more hardline, more hawkish, and in many ways more radical and dangerous than the one before. That some of the moderates so-called moderates that we used to deal with have been killed, and so in many cases replaced by more extreme figures. So it's hard to see how this is conceivably in America's interests.